So the purpose of our Active Learning Network is really to be active as the Jewish community in addressing gun violence prevention locally and nationally. Really, we want the emphasis on this work to be on the active part. If you're a part of the Reform Movement's conversation in the tent, we have a group that lives there where we hope that you'll participate in the conversation. We'll be posting recordings of our webinars, the series of webinars that we do in the tent, in the gun violence prevention group. And following this webinar, we'll email everybody that registered a link where they can join that conversation. The other big purpose of this is to develop programming for congregations, communities, and families to actively discuss and engage in gun violence prevention initiatives. That's not only educational programming, but it's actionable programs. Things that you can do with your hands by volunteering, connecting with community organizations, and more to really help make an impact for the better on the problem. And then, of course, there's advocacy. The Reform Movement's office here in DC, the Religious Action Center, exists to be an advocate for the Jewish community, and so we'll be connecting you to advocacy opportunities as well, and you'll hear some of that today. Our Active Learning Network will run in a series of webinars over the course of 3 to 4 months. Our goal is to have sessions every 3 weeks on average that last no more than an hour. And we're going to do our very best to keep them at 12 Eastern so that it overlaps with the lunch hour for those of you here. There may be times that we need to move the timing and the date around, but for the most part, Tuesdays at 12 Eastern are when we're hoping to host webinars. And just so you know, the future topics that we'll be focusing on include how gun violence affects women and youth, how we can engage interfaith audiences, grow our advocacy, and so much more. We're already seeing questions coming in, which is awesome. One of those is, will we receive a list of participants on the call? And we can't release that without everybody's permission, but if we can get you to join the conversation in the tent, you can actively participate with everyone there. So one of the really cool features about this Zoom software that we're using for the webinar is we have the ability to poll you. So I'm going to launch a poll right now, and if you're on a computer, I hope that you'll just take the time to ask, or to answer the question that I'm about to ask, which is, are you participating in this webinar as part of a congregational team? The reason that we're asking that question is because we really want you to be empowered as congregational leaders with your rabbis, if you're a lay leader, and with your laity, if you're a professional staff member or a member of the clergy, to make an impact, to write programming, to implement programming, and to get engaged, not only yourselves, but to also engage your entire congregational community and hopefully an interfaith community. There's not a right or a wrong way to participate. You are welcome to participate here if you're not part of a team, but we're just curious. And I can see that as the results come in, lots of you are participating as part of a congregational team, which is great. For those of you that aren't, I would encourage you after this webinar to try and find members of your congregation who might want to participate along with you. What we found in the past is that when I join a webinar with a colleague, I'm much more likely to engage in a conversation afterward and advance our agenda together, to share ideas, to brainstorm, and to find the best ways that we can engage a larger audience. So what I'm going to do now is turn my camera off. I'm going to turn the webinar over to Tracy Wolf. She's one of the Religious Action Center's legislative assistants. She's going to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, and then she will also be leading a conversation with a few of you towards the end of this. With that, I'll turn it over to Tracy.
Great, thank you, Isaac. We are very excited that our issue area expert that we will be hearing from today is Tim Daly, the Managing Director for Guns and Crime Policy at the Center for American Progress. Prior to joining American Progress, Daly served as the Interim Chief of Staff and Legislative Director to Representative Mike Thompson, where one of his responsibilities was directing the House Democratic Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, which Representative Thompson chairs. Originally from Albany, New York, Daly graduated from the University of Maryland and the Georgetown University Law Center, and today he will be giving us an overview on gun violence in the United States. So welcome, Tim.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. And let me move this camera here. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all today, and thank you for inviting me here for the first of your many webinars on this subject. So I guess most of you are on the computer here, some are by telephone. For those that are on the computer, you will be able to have the benefit of a quick PowerPoint presentation that will also run parallel with our discussion today, and I'm sure the folks here will make this available for those who are only participating by telephone. And a couple of quick caveats. I do apologize. I work in this issue area in the weeds sometimes too much, and I've already been advised that perhaps some of the words I may use may not be clear to all. So if at any point there becomes an issue where you don't understand a concept or a term or an issue area that I'm talking about, please feel free to ask. I will say, though, that I think we're going to try and hold most of the questions until the end, just so we can try and get through some of this substance, and then definitely have time for questions and answers and also the discussion that Tracy was just talking about. So as Tracy mentioned, I'm from the Center for American Progress. We are a think tank here in Washington, D.C., and for the last 3 years or so, the Center for American Progress has worked on the issue of gun violence prevention. I have worked on that team for the last 2 years, having worked on and off the Hill for the last 10 or so years. So it is a pleasure to be here, and why don't we jump right into it? So we let's see here, hit the wrong button. Okay. So in terms of the summary of what I want to talk about quickly is really fits into 3 buckets. One, we jumped too far ahead here. Sorry. See here, is 3 buckets. One is kind of where is the world of gun violence prevention in this period of post-Newtown? The Newtown shooting in December of 2012 really is a key benchmark period for us to kind of start our discussion with. So I want to talk quickly about what that universe looked like immediately after that shooting. Then I want to transition quickly into kind of what's happening in 2016. Where is the activity? Where is the movement? And then third, want to kind of end up, where are the themes and opportunities that may inform some of your advocacy, some of your discussions, and where some of the direction of this debate is going this year and beyond. So just real quickly, to set the table here, some gun stats that I think many of us are familiar with, unfortunately, which is, on average, we see that about 88 Americans are killed each day with guns, and about 2/3 of those are by suicides. And we get that number from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which tells us that 33,000 or so Americans each year are killed with a firearm, which is just a staggering number. And then when you compare that number with other countries, especially those developed countries that we view as our peers, that number is just astronomically higher than the others. And that is a point that we like to highlight, just because we want to try and understand why is it that our situation is different than others, and what is it that we can do to reduce the number of gun deaths that we have. And I'll say this, is that a lot of the gun numbers and gun death numbers that you hear about, there is a desire for more information and better data so we can better talk about these issues and do better about coming up with solutions. I will say that one of the limitations that we have is that over the last several years, there have been systematic efforts, primarily by the gun lobby, to prevent some of this data from becoming available. And that really is one of the things that prevents us, I think, from developing the best possible case. So that's why you hear a lot of the same numbers over and over again, about the 33,000 Americans who are killed each year, the 88 Americans who are killed with guns each day. And that's just because of the limited data set that's available to us. So let's talk quickly about the perceived state of the gun violence prevention movement from December 2012 forward. The perception is, and the media has said that, the gun violence prevention movement, or some people call it the gun control movement, is really not getting very far. They point to the fact that Congress has not really passed any substantive legislation since Newtown. In fact, they tried and famously failed. Folks may recall in April of 2013 that the U.S. Senate tried to vote on things like background checks and new limitations on gun trafficking and straw purchasing, and those failed. And then they point to the fact that in other states, like in Colorado, there were a few state senators who helped pass background checks in their state legislature, and even though they were in the final year of their final term in office, gun lobby experts then had those folks recalled, so to kind of send that chilling message to state legislators that, hey, maybe this isn't really an area that you should be working in. And then separately in other states like Georgia and Ohio, we saw ideas where legislation was being considered that would allow guns to be, quite frankly, everywhere or anywhere. And as it relates to you, there were some efforts even in Georgia to say that that would include places of worship. Ultimately, some of those ideas were pared back to say that places of worship have the option to allow guns to be carried in a concealed fashion into those places of worship. But, that was on the table as well. Again, the idea of being able to carry guns anywhere, everywhere, at any time. But this perception, as many of you are well aware of, whether it be on guns or otherwise, is not really the reality. In the last 2.5 years, we have seen a tremendous amount of interest in progress and movement on this issue of gun violence. And I want to highlight just a couple of things before we get into kind of where the world looks this year, 2016. First and foremost, there has been meaningful legislation that has been passed. Whether that be at the state level, where we've seen up to 18 states now pass background checks legislation, or to require background checks when gun sales are had there. At the federal level, we've seen the president now take several executive actions in 2013, again in 2014, and then most recently in January to help close and limit things like the background checks loopholes at certain places. So we've seen meaningful progress at the legislative front. Separately, at the organizational side, we have seen just enormous amounts of interest and momentum from the number of groups that are becoming involved in this issue. We have seen new groups start from nothing. Groups like Mom Demand Action, or former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords started a group called Americans for Responsible Solutions. We have seen just a surge of interest by other multi-issue organizations, whether that be in the form of unions or women's organizations or faith organizations. We have seen the gun control organizations that existed previously just absolutely see their budgets and their infrastructure just become intensely more significant. And all of this has happened over a very quick amount of time. And then separately, we have started to see a shift in the political narrative, and I'm sure many of you have witnessed this just hearing the politics of these presidential campaigns and these congressional campaigns that are happening these days. Following what happened in 1994, where a lot of people were talking about guns, and then Congress passed a bunch of things relating to guns, and then the NRA and others said, okay, we're going to hold those people accountable who voted the wrong way, and then they claimed credit for changing a lot of the political atmosphere here in DC. That 1994 experience has kind of lived on in people's minds here in Washington for decades at this point. And it has really chilled most of Congress's interest and ability to work on guns. And the reason I mention all of this is that in 2013 and then in 2014 through today, that narrative is changing. We are seeing a lot more people thinking that guns and working in gun violence prevention really is the political high ground. And therefore, they are wanting to work on this issue at a level that we have not quite seen before. So let's talk about 2016 and what we expect in terms of some of the key kind of policy areas and where the opportunities for change exist before we then turn to where there may be opportunities for folks like yourself to engage here. Like I mentioned earlier, in January of this year, the President announced a very significant new set of executive actions. And what these went to were what we have on the slide. They went to 4 main areas. One, how we can start to close, not close entirely, but how we can start to close it a little bit on this background checks loophole. Again, for those who are not familiar, and actually most Americans believe this, believe this to be true, I should say, that not everybody has to have a background check when they buy a firearm. Under current federal law, the only people who need to have a background check are those who go to a gun store that is licensed with the Bureau of ATF, and therefore they then get a background check when they go to one of those gun stores. But if you go and buy your gun online, or you go and buy it from a neighbor, or you see an ad on things like Facebook, and then you buy a gun from that type of venue, there is no background check requirement. And some estimate that upwards of 40% of all guns that are sold in this country are in that loophole, so not subject to a background check, meaning people who would certainly be prohibited from getting a firearm, like a criminal, someone who is a domestic abuser, someone who may even be a terrorist for that matter, can go and buy a gun with no questions asked. So that's why you see a lot of emphasis on this background checks loophole and what can be done to narrow that loophole. And that's what the president was trying to do in January. We tried to come up with ways to narrow it, but can't narrow it completely. Only Congress and state legislatures can do that. But what can we do to refine some of the definitions that would expand the number of places that would have to register as being a federally licensed gun dealer? The president also announced 3 other buckets of things, how he was going to use the resources that he has available to him to increase the enforcement of the current laws that we have on the books. The third thing was how we can use the money we have currently to increase mental health treatment that's available to Americans across the country. And then the last thing he said is, how can we incentivize new gun technology to be developed so that guns aren't used by accident? And what I mean by that is, the president used an example that several years ago, when we were having problems with like aspirin and Tylenol bottles, all sorts of new technology was put in place to ensure that a 3-year-old couldn't open a Tylenol bottle by accident. How is it that we don't have such smart technology when it comes to our firearms? And I think the president challenged us with his executive action to do something about that, and also put behind it the buying power of the federal government to try and help that technology develop. So why did the president announce all this? I think the president announced it all because he realized in the fall of last year, in October and in November, following that terrible shooting at the Umpqua Community College shooting in Oregon, that the public was demanding that action be taken, and that we weren't going to wait for folks in Congress or in state legislatures, that it was imperative for those who have the ability to act to do so now. And that is the reason why that announcement happened when it did. And I mention this because there are many other opportunities for those people who have the opportunity to act, and that they need to act now. And that, I think, is a lot of what is going to color the rest of 2016, is that you're going to see actors who are in that similar type position. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, but those actors to do something. Now, with respect to Congress, that's a different story. We could have a whole other webinar on what Congress can and can't do. The short answer is we really don't expect a lot from Congress in the gun space between now and the end of this year. Congress, we think, will be doing the bare minimum when it comes to all of their constitutional responsibilities, and will be mostly focused towards getting reelected by the time they get to midsummer. So we really don't have a whole lot of ambition for what Congress is going to do over the next several months. So let's talk about that other point that I was making about those who have the ability to act and the demand that they do so. And really, we think this fits into this bucket of this state and local executive action. And what I mean by that is a governor, an attorney general, a big city mayor, they already have enforcement opportunities. They already have funding that is available to them. And similar to what the president did, they have the ability to just act tomorrow on guns. And we think that there's going to be a huge surge of that activity over the course of 2016. And that, I think, is going to be for 3 reasons. Number one, the president is pushing it. The president is now, and the vice president as well, now view this issue to be one of the top issues that they work on. And I think that they're concerned to some extent about what the White House's legacy is on this issue of guns. Second, we talked earlier about that surge of interest amongst outside organizations, from the gun control organizations to those that are in unions to those that are in the faith community. That level of interest is so high, and the pressure that is building is so strong. There is clearly a sense of needing to act on the part of these executives. And so that outside advocacy is having a huge effect. And then third, we talked about this as well, this issue of gun violence is turning into the political high ground. People view working on guns now that are in elected offices as something that they should do, that this is good political business for them and it's in their interest. And maybe we don't necessarily agree with their recent decision to work on guns because it's in their political interest. We will certainly take advantage of that in the short term. And I looked at a couple of examples, but to color this out, like, well, what is it that we're talking about in state and local executive action? Well, recently in Virginia, the Attorney General there looked at the agreements that their state has with other states around the country with respect to concealed carry permits. And what that is that in many states, well, actually all states now, a person who has a firearm can go and either go through the training process they have in that state or fill out the paperwork in that state, and they can get permission to walk in their community with a concealed firearm. And one of the issues that the gun lobby had over several years ago was, well, geez, if I can, have a concealed carry permit in Montana and I want to go to a neighboring state, why should the law stop me from being able to go to another state if I have the ability to do it in my own state? And so you see all these reciprocity agreements that were created. But you probably could tell from my description of that not all state laws are the same. It is much easier to get a concealed carry permit in some states compared to others. Some states actually have really no requirements at all. All you need to do is just show that you're a citizen and you can carry a concealed firearm in that state. Whereas other states say, perhaps we should have a higher background check. Perhaps we should require you to have a training over several hours, or take tests, or show that that you can handle a firearm before you walk around our communities with that concealed. And because not all states are the same, there's a question of which states should recognize other states' agreements, and that's what the Virginia Attorney General did. They went and they took a hard look at every state that they had one of these agreements with, and they said, well, if that other state doesn't meet our standard here in Virginia, we're no longer going to respect that agreement. And that has had a profound effect of trying to lift the floor as it relates to the concealed carry permitting processes in states. In Washington State, in January of this year, we saw him issue a new executive order dealing with how they're going to share various data points and to try and build a new public health campaign on suicide with an emphasis on firearms. Because when we're talking about suicide, we're largely talking about firearms. The vast, vast majority of suicides that are committed these days are as a result of firearms. And then in Boston, the Boston mayor has recently convened every major New England mayor and police chief to start a regional approach on how they can coordinate on their enforcement around gun violence. And then I'll just quickly go through this, and I don't want to get too bogged down on the details on the state legislative side, but while you see the executives finding ways to act, like governors and big city mayors, you're also seeing state legislators becoming exponentially more involved. And we are seeing many more state legislators introducing bills, both on the gun violence prevention side, but also candidly on the gun lobby side. And both sides, quite honestly, are having some victories. We could talk for hours about all the different bills that are out there and where they're moving forward and where they're not. And I know there is a very diverse set of states represented on this call. And should you have any questions about legislation in your state, we're happy to work with the folks here to get that information to you. But in the interest of time, why don't I just quickly talk through some of the highlights of some of the things that we see. Number one, on domestic violence, there is a strong nexus between domestic violence and firearm violence. And so you see a lot of legislation in states to try and prohibit certain domestic abusers from being able to have access to firearms. And in the last 3 years, we've seen 20 or so states pass legislation to that effect to try and limit the access to firearms of these domestic abusers. On background checks, we talked about the background checks loophole, and we've seen a number of states try and close that. But again, the limitation of passing this at the state level is that it only applies to that state. What is to prevent someone from California, which has very strong gun safety laws, from simply going across the border to Nevada, which has very weak gun safety laws, buying a firearm there, going home and using it? That is one of the issues that you have with a state-by-state state legislative approach. And then let me just quickly go over the defensive side where we're seeing some of these things, especially as they relate to you all, is that we have started to see this idea from the gun lobby to allow guns to be carried anywhere at any time by anyone. Is kind of how I would sum up many of the bullets that you see under there under the defensive state legislative activity. And by that I mean the gun lobby is interested in allowing those who have the ability to carry a concealed firearm to carry that firearm on college campuses, amazingly in elementary or middle school or high schools, and in some places, in bars and restaurants and places of worship. Now, on that last point, on places of worship, yeah, I will say that in most states, they still leave it up to the places of worship to decide if they want to allow firearms to be carried in your institution. And most places of worship have declined to allow that. But that is not stopping some from still introducing legislation to either remove the option on the part of the place of worship or to try and provide more incentives for you to allow them to begin with. And that really hit a fever pitch after the terrible shooting that happened in Charleston, South Carolina last summer, where, as folks know, 9 folks were having a Bible study at the AME church, and a state senator who happened to be the head of that church was leading that session when a white supremacist came into the church and killed almost everyone who was there at that Bible study. And many others across the country took that example to believe that if everybody in that Bible study had a firearm to protect themselves, then perhaps that shooting wouldn't have occurred, or that the carnage would not have been nearly as bad. Now, we disagree with those points, but we will leave to you on the approach that you want to take in your community, in your state. But again, wanted to just kind of give you a flavor of some of the legislative battles that we continue to see playing out over the course of 2016. And so at the back end of 2016, and I know that that we don't want to talk too much about electoral politics here, but I think it's important to kind of contextualize some of the work or the kind of the universe that we are living in. The 2016 elections, I think, will be very important as it relates to the issue of gun violence prevention. First and foremost, we have the actual presidential campaign and these congressional races and these state legislative races. And I mentioned earlier that guns has kind of turned into the political high ground for many candidates. And so we think that a lot of people will be talking about guns throughout the balance of this electoral year. And I think there's risks associated with that, but there's also benefits. The risks are all those candidates who talk about guns then lose, and then that kind of confirms that narrative that we talked about earlier from 1994 that, geez, maybe we as policyholders and elective office holders, we shouldn't be talking and working in this gun violence prevention space because it is not in our political self-interest. In fact, we would lose our office if we did. On the other hand, if many of these folks are successful, and we still believe that they will be, then we think that that narrative from 1994 will no longer exist, and perhaps that will give us bigger policy space in 2017 and beyond to work on these issues. But from our view, the outcomes of the 2016 elections will be critical in kind of setting the new trajectory on what is possible in the policy space in 2017. And then more specifically, several gun violence prevention issues are going to be on the ballot in 2016. And on the slide you have in front of you, you have a list of where some of these may be. In Maine and in Nevada, background checks ballot initiatives, so questions on whether or not they should close the background checks loophole entirely in their states, will be put to the voters in those 2 states. Those have already qualified, so voters will be voting on that for sure. 2 other states are trying to get policy questions on gun violence on their ballots. In California, there will be several policy issue areas, like on should there be background checks for things like ammunition sales, should people who lose or have their guns stolen, should they be compelled to report that to law enforcement? So those questions will be all packaged under one question that voters in California will be considering later this year. And in Washington State, they will have another question. They just passed a ballot question in 2014 dealing with background checks, and the supporters of that ballot initiative were so overwhelmed by the level of support that they received that they're going to go back to the ballot on another question, which deals with this idea of an extreme risk protection order. In the interest of time, I won't get into that, but that really is the question of, if someone is demonstrably a risk to themselves or others, and I know that, and you know that, and maybe a family member knows that, this issue goes to the concept of, well, what process could be in place where I might be able to notify a court or something to prevent that person from being able to get access to firearms. And then the last one I'll just put out here as a flag is we do expect that in Arizona there may be another background checks question as well. That one has not been qualified yet for the ballot, so that one's still a little uncertain, but the other ones are certainly well on their way. So let's talk then quickly that third bucket area before we stop our discussion here and open up to questions and then the moderated discussion. I know Tracy's going to lead. What are the themes then for 2016, and where are the opportunities to plug into everything that we just talked about? Well, on the theme side, clearly, I'm biased, of course, but momentum is on our side. We are seeing that surge continue from 2013 to 14 to 15 into 2016. That more and more folks are getting involved here. People are sick and tired of the repeated mass shootings that happen almost weekly at this point. They see the shooting that happened this past weekend in Kalamazoo, Michigan. They remember the shootings that happened throughout the summer of last year, where it seemed like each month there was just a new horrific activity. And they say, we want to become more involved. We need to do something about it. So momentum is on our side. We also see coordination increasing between all of those people who are coming to this issue, and the assets that are engaging are continuing to be new. We continue to see this focus on state and local. It's no longer just a question of what is the president going to do and what is Congress going to do, but we see this increased focus on state and local as well, so that all actors who have the ability to do something, we see them now becoming engaged and interested, in many cases actually do something. And then lastly, we just finished talking about the 2016 elections. I mean, that will be a key moment on the political viability of guns and kind of setting the new trajectory of this issue, we think, for 2017. So then talking just finally about how gun violence will succeed and really where those meaningful policy opportunities will come from. Like I said, Congress really is not poised to act until Congress changes, likely in 2017. But where there are going to be opportunities in the very near term is going to come from policy changes by non-government actors. Where are folks like Facebook or pension funds, as you think about people who invest their money and then selectively divest it in order to make policy change? Where are other consumer organizations or corporate organizations? Where are they going to start to become more involved in this issue? How are the cultural norms on guns and gun safety going to change? And that, I think, is an important point as we kind of move forward on this issue of guns. And what I mean by that is that in years past, people have said, well, shouldn't we just ban guns like they did in Australia? That clearly has had an impact. They have not had any more mass shootings since they did that several years ago. I think the cultural norms in the United States have changed in that most people recognize now that people have a right to have firearms in this country. And the Supreme Court has spoken on that issue, and others have as well. And really what we're talking about is, from a cultural point of view, is how do we prevent guns from getting into the hands of dangerous people? And that's really how we, at the Center for American Progress, talk about it, is how do we make sure that felons and domestic abusers or those that are espousing hate and extreme behavior don't have access to firearms. And I think it is that change of our culture here in the United States where people are starting to, I think about this issue slightly differently, that you're starting to see people like Facebook, people like the Trader Joe's of the world who just announced policy of like, you know what, we agree, maybe we shouldn't have firearms in our stores or in our facilities and things like that. Sure, you can have them all you want, but maybe we shouldn't have them here. And then lastly, on the action by state, county, municipal elected leadership, really goes to that question about state executive action, state and local executive action. How can people who have the ability to act, how can they just do so? So that is very, very quickly, and we could talk about this for hours, kind of the quick broad brush of where we were, what we expect in 2016, and some of the themes that we expect moving forward. So with that, why don't I turn it back to Tracy in the event that we have any questions or for the discussion you plan to lead.
Yes, great. Thank you, Tim. So we have a few minutes for some questions. As Isaac pointed out before, if anyone would like to ask him a question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. We'll give you all a minute to do that.
So I don't see any questions just yet, but feel free to go ahead and type those in at any point over the next few minutes. What we'll do is jump into to our conversation from here. So I'm going to go ahead and begin unmuting a few of our our panelists, and I'll turn it to Tracy.
Great. So we're going to thank Tim again for giving us that great overview of the gun violence prevention landscape in the United States. I know it will help a lot of the congregations that we have on the call to start thinking about the issues pertaining to gun violence that they would like to program on in the future. So the second part of this initial webinar will give us a chance to discuss the successes and struggles that congregations have faced in trying to program and take action around gun violence. For today's discussion, we have selected a handful of clergy members to lead us in this conversation. We will be hearing from Rabbi Ethan Baer from Temple Sinai in Reno, Nevada, Cantor Rosalie Boxt from Temple Emmanuel in Kensington, Maryland, and Rabbi Danny Berkman from the Community Synagogue in Port Washington, New York. While we take a minute to unmute them, I want to note that these types of discussions will be an ongoing part of our active learning network, and that we will be reaching out to different people each week to be a part of our conversation. So if you are interested in being included in a discussion on a future webinar, please feel free to email me, and we'll have my contact information on a slide at the end of this webinar. And also, if you would like to join in our discussion that we are having today, please be sure to type your questions or comments in and submit them through the Q&A box, just as you would ask a question to Tim if there are still any remaining.
And I see that Danny Berkman has joined us. Rabbi Danny Berkman has joined us on the screen. We don't see Cantor Boxt or Rabbi Baer on right now. So if either of you are on, please go ahead and make sure that you're on by a computer. That's how you can contribute to the conversation. And if not, Tim, Tracy, and Rabbi Berkman can start the conversation.
Great. Okay. So now that our speakers are unmuted, we're going to get started. So we can all feel free to answer and chime in after one another. And we'll get started with asking what subsets of your congregation are the hardest and easiest to engage in this topic, and why. So if you found that you have started to engage your congregation around gun violence prevention, who are the easiest and who are the hardest people to engage around this topic?
So from our perspective here at the Community Synagogue, when we've spoken about the issue, and when we've discussed the issue, generally there's been a willingness and an eagerness to engage with this subject of gun violence prevention. And I think that various elements of our community feel that they've been affected by it and impacted by it in a way that leads them to want to take action on this issue in a wider setting. And one of the things that was striking is that in the aftermath of Newtown, it became a very real issue for the synagogue in terms of thinking about what our security situation is and what the things are that we need and what we want as a synagogue. And it was really, in that case, it was the parents of the synagogue who were very concerned about the issue of gun violence prevention and of making the synagogue a more secure place for our children. And I think that extends then to thinking about the ways that we can engage with this issue in a wider context.
Great, thank you. And have you had any experience on embracing congregants' diverse opinions on the issue of gun violence prevention? I know that obviously this has become a topic of conversation since the Newtown shooting, but not everyone feels the same way around gun violence prevention. So we just wanted to know if you have any suggestions or if you've had any struggles embracing congregants' diverse opinions on the issue of gun violence prevention.
I think from our perspective here and from my personal perspective, I think that there are clearly some people who have divergent views on the issue and who bring different opinions to the issue. But when we're thinking about it from the religious perspective, I think it's moving away from the subject simply of gun control, but to a subject of gun violence prevention. I think in that context, there are concerns that all of us have about gun violence generally. There might be different diagnoses of what the problem is and what causes it and how to tackle it. But the issue of the numbers themselves and the number of people who are being killed every day and every year in this country and the way that is happening is something that is of concern to everyone. And I think by focusing more on the wider issue of gun violence rather than specific gun control issues, I think that allows us to engage more people with this debate. And I think that really is the key issue, is how do we bring down levels of gun violence in this country so that it's safer for everyone.
Great, thank you. And I see that Cantor Box has joined. Do you have anything that you'd like to add to your experience?
Sure, thank you. So our experience is a little different only because, one, in Maryland at least, the laws are pretty good, and so a lot of the work that we're doing is involving strengthening our work. And in addition, I have a member of my congregation, Daniel Webster, who is one of the experts on gun violence, works gun policy and prevention at Johns Hopkins, so he's been a great resource for us. We have not found any significant challenges in terms of the political sphere or how we engage our members, in part because we've been really intentional about talking about gun violence, and we've just begun to consider relationships with gun owners, about involving people, whether they're members of our congregation or people in our communities whom we know who own guns, to be part of our conversation. My team has really wanted to focus both on some legislative work, but mostly about telling our stories, our personal stories, as well as hearing stories from others. So when our team engages the larger congregation, we pretty much focus on the issue of gun death, of ending gun death, and not so much about being anti-gun. And we do that both in our language, and two, again, as our team continues to figure out different ways that we can affect change, we really want to focus on partnering with people who may own guns, who may be part of, who may have elected or support representatives who have a relationship with the NRA, but to tell stories and find common themes around wanting to end gun death, which our experience in the stories we hear from others is that most gun owners are opposed to gun death, to senseless gun death. We're working now on a domestic abuse law. So we have really tried to focus on not gun ownership or the NRA. We really don't focus on that, but on being in relationship with all different people to make sure that we uphold life in all ways.
Great, thank you. I also see we have Rabbi Ethan Baer on from Reno, Nevada. So if you have anything to add, or if Danny, you have anything else to comment, you all can feel free to chime in as well.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciated Tim's presentation, especially around kind of the defensive and offensive legislation that's happening on both sides of the state level. And in Nevada, what really propelled Temple Sinai into this issue, besides it being such an important moral issue nationwide, is there was all of this proposed guns everywhere, quote, guns everywhere legislation, and one of them was campus carry. So we found that our folks who are connected to the university in town, which are a lot, became, their self-interest was very much in the battle against campus carry in Reno. And that kind of catapulted us into taking action and framing this as this is about people feeling safe at work, and this is about our congregants maybe not staying in Reno if this is the kind of atmosphere that we're going to be creating. And so we found sort of the easiest to engage are university folks, as well as younger members, as Danny said, also families in the congregation who I think also, for whom it's also closer to home when there's these kinds of proposed legislation for guns to be in schools. So those are the groups that have been easiest, and the more difficult, frankly, have been people who have been in Reno longer, who are maybe have taken on some of the libertarian ethos of the culture here, which is probably the biggest hurdle to working on these issues here. The kind of idea that if I have a gun and you have a gun, it's like whoever's standing last is the luckiest. It's the stand your ground culture that does not at all feel Jewish, but is some of the older members of the congregation have taken on. And as far as conversations and how we've kept diverse opinions, at the table, I think keeping it to values conversations and framing it as both Cantor Box and Rabbi Berkman said, around human life values, and that's definitely the most important and not always easy. But I also think that we talk about how can we frame the conversation as moral instead of political. It is political, and I think part of our job as clergy is how do we make political into not a dirty word, that political means translating our values, actualizing them in the world, and how do we take a stand not just as clergy but as a congregation and lead our congregations to take a stand. So what we've done recently is with help from Isaac and the RAC and some of their suggestions, the board's passed a process by which we take a stand on public policy as a congregation. And so we're in process of doing that with the background check initiative on the ballot in Nevada to say Temple Sinai supports universal background checks on gun sales. And finally, the main programming we've been doing is we started an interfaith coalition in Reno for gun responsibility. And it really began after the Charleston shooting. And we had an interfaith vigil at the AME church in town in the wake of that shooting. And since then, a number of clergy in the community have said, okay, this is something we really need to do. And I've found the AME pastor in Reno has been the main leader with me in it. And I think education is really important, holding forums for education, holding teach-ins, framing it as a public health issue. Gun violence prevention as a public health issue is really important. And taking multiple approaches at once. So Rabbi Joel Mosbacker's effort through the IAF called Do Not Stand Idly By, which is really about mayors and leaders at the municipal level putting pressure on gun manufacturers to take more responsibility, both for smart technology and for distribution practices. We've been doing that, and we got our mayor in town to sign on to that letter. And then, working at the legislative level, since we have this ballot initiative in 2016 on the books, and then continuing to do these teach-ins and inviting people like local sheriffs and police chiefs to the educational forums and really including them. I mean, that's been somewhat of a challenge for us because there are sheriffs who support what we're doing, and there are other sheriffs that are less enthusiastic about what we're doing. But that's been really key as well.
Great, thank you. So I know, Rabbi Bear, you touched on some programs that your congregation has put on gun violence prevention in the past and what you're doing moving forward. And you spoke about some of the most important elements of that. Do either Rabbi Berkman or Cantor Box have anything to add about the most important aspects of gun violence prevention programming, or what needs to be included, or maybe if you've attended some programs on gun violence prevention in the past, what has been missing?
I could just add, and similar to what Ethan mentioned, I think finding partners in a lot of work, even if we see slow results, the sort of small wins of finding strength of other people who have similar commitments can often help a community. So we have a relationship also with another synagogue and some churches connected also through Do Not Stand Idly By, and now doing independent work, Jews United for Justice nearby, Marylanders Preventing Gun Violence, and involving other people in the conversation in terms of our program and the time we spend is really helpful, both to get information, to find out what other kinds of opportunities there is for activism. And so I think finding partners in the work is a really wonderful way also, which I think can potentially remove some of the political pressure that a congregation doesn't have to take a stand either way, but is part of a broader community coalition to help facilitate change. So I'd add that.
I think in terms of us here, we're in the earlier stages of our process, but I think in terms of approaching the subject, for us, one of the priorities has been really in the way that I think Ethan touched on was that we're looking at what the Jewish values are that compel us on this issue, and thinking about it really, those ideas of not standing idly by the blood of our neighbor, and of also the call that the voice of my brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And so thinking about those kind of Jewish imperatives that we have within our tradition and how this issue relates to those subjects has been central, I think, to the way that we've started to approach this subject. And what's been striking is that as we've begun to tackle it and kind of approach the congregation about this, it's been striking to see how many people have been personally affected by gun violence in their lives and in their extended families. And I was quite surprised when we reached out to the congregation, first of all, by the level of response that we got, which was very high for us, and then by the number of people who, in responding, shared personal experience or personal engagement with this subject already at this point. And I think for us, as we move forward, that's going to be really important in drawing on the personal experience and the personal stories that people have of how gun violence and the gun death has affected their families.
Great. Thank you so much to all three of our clergy presenters, and to anyone who has questions for them in the future. You can definitely feel free to either continue to ask questions over the Q&A button on your webinar screen, or to reach out to the REC, and we can be sure to connect you with the appropriate people. So as you could tell from our discussion, there's a lot of room for educational programming, action, and advocacy around gun violence prevention, and we are excited to see what all of you are able to come up with and share with the rest of our movement. We are in the process of finalizing our next webinar for the Active Learning Network, and we'll share the date, time, and topic over email very soon. We will also be sure to send out the link to the webinar recording to everyone who registered, and we'll have it available for viewing on our website at rac.org as well. If you haven't done so already, like Isaac said at the beginning of the webinar, we would love for you and try to form a congregational team. These teams can include clergy members, congregational staff, social action leaders, youth, and any other interested lay leaders from around your congregation. Again, creating or joining a team will allow you to best create and implement meaningful programming and take meaningful action within your congregation. And lastly, on the screen, you can see the contact information for myself, Isaac, and Tim, if you would like to contact us with any questions or feedback. That just about wraps up our webinar for today. Thank you all again for joining us, and we look forward to learning and working with you on our next Active Learning Network webinar. Are we done?